the world unraveled on a summer day in 1914. It began with a single bullet, fired from the pistol of a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist. When Gavrilo Princip pulled the trigger on June 28th, killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, no one could have predicted the chain of events that would soon engulf the world in fire, blood, and ruin. Within weeks, the stage was set for what would become the First World War, a catastrophe on a scale humanity had never before witnessed. This was not a war fought in a single theatre. It was a sprawling global conflict that split Europe into two armed camps. On one side, the Allies, led by Britain, France, and Russia. On the other, the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. But these alliances were only the skeleton of the conflict. What ignited the war, what fueled it, were the combustible forces of nationalism, militarism, imperial competition, and a web of alliances so rigid and fragile that a single spark was all it took to bring the entire system crashing down. The outbreak of war in 1914 found Europe ill-prepared for the horrors that would follow. Soldiers marched off to battle with enthusiasm. There were parades, cheers, and promises that they'd be home by Christmas. But the reality of war could not have been more different. The battles that unfolded were not swift or decisive. They were grinding, brutal, and suffocatingly static. Welcome to the trenches. Imagine this: miles upon miles of fortified ditches zigzagging across the landscape, filled with soldiers living in unspeakable conditions. Mud, rats, the stench of decay, and the ever-present threat of death. These were not only battlefields, they were prisons. The Western Front, stretching from the coast of Belgium to the border of Switzerland, became the very definition of stalemate. Here, the new face of war revealed itself, not swords and horses, but machine guns, poison gas, artillery shells, and tanks. Modern technology had collided with 19th century tactics, and the result was carnage on an industrial scale. At Verdun, in 1916, the French and Germans were locked in a battle that lasted nearly a year. Over 1 million men were wounded or killed, all for just a few miles of ground. The Somme followed shortly after, where on the first day alone, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties, one of the deadliest days in military history. And in the east, the Russian Empire struggled against the Central Powers, sending waves of poorly equipped soldiers into a meat grinder that ultimately helped lead to revolution back home. The global scale of the war meant it wasn't confined to Europe. Battles raged in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. In the Ottoman Empire, the Gallipoli campaign became a bloody stalemate, forever etched in the histories of nations like Australia and New Zealand. At sea, German submarines prowled the oceans in unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking ships indiscriminately, and drawing the United States closer to entering the conflict. There was the toll on the home front. This was a total war. Every man, woman, and child lived in its shadow. Factories churned out munitions, and propaganda filled newspapers and posters, urging citizens to do their part. The cost of war touched every household, bringing rationing, hardship, and grief. With millions conscripted, many families received the dreaded telegram bearing the words, "We regret to inform you." Yet the stalemate couldn't last forever. By 1917, the ground beneath Europe began shifting. New powers entered the fray. The United States, spurred on by German aggression and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, joined the Allied cause. Russia, on the other hand, collapsed into chaos, leaving the war after the October Revolution. The injection of fresh American troops tipped the balance, and by 1918, the Central Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. But victory came at an unspeakable price. Over 9 million soldiers had died, with millions more gassed, maimed, or scarred. Civilian casualties soared too. Epidemics, famine, and violence took their toll. The final armistice, signed on November 11, 1918, brought the shooting to a halt, but peace was hardly kind to the defeated nations. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations and humiliations on Germany, setting the stage for even darker days ahead. World War I was meant to be the war to end all wars. It was not, but it was the war that changed everything. As we reflect on the war today, more than a century later, the lessons remain vital. Let us remember this: World War I began with a single gunshot. Its echoes, even now, have not fully faded. The horrors endured and the lives lost demand that we never forget the weight of those 4 terrible years, nor the ordinary people who bore their extraordinary cost.